Drake got a work bonus and a tax refund in the very same month, $32,000 all told, and did the thing that feels the safest. He just left it sitting in checking. Daniel got a fairly similar windfall around the very same time. He kept about 5,000 of it in checking and moved the rest somewhere else entirely. 1 year later, that decision quietly cost Drake over $1,000, not through a bad investment, not through a hidden fee, just through where the money happened to be sitting the whole time. This video is about the actual answer to how much should I keep in checking, a question almost nobody has a real number for, and it turns out there are two different ceilings that matter here. One that protects the money outright, and one that protects its value over time. Quick one before we get into it, if this kind of real numbers breakdown is useful, hit subscribe, new video every week. A checking account has one job: handle money that's about to move. Rent, groceries, the phone bill, a debit card swipe at the grocery store. Checking is built for cash that's going to leave again within days or weeks, not cash that's meant to sit and grow. The problem is what checking accounts pay for holding that money in the meantime, which, for most banks, is close to nothing. The national average checking account interest rate sat at just 0.07% AP as of mid-2026. And that average already includes the small share of interest-bearing checking accounts pulling the number up. Most standard checking accounts pay exactly zero. At 0.07%, Drake's $32,000 earned him about $22 over the entire year. Account. And it's the whole reason this question is worth a real answer instead of a guess. It's worth understanding why checking rates stay this low in the first place, and it isn't complicated. Banks lend out deposits and profit from the spread between what they pay depositors and what they collect from borrowers. Checking balances typically move constantly and are expensive for a bank to plan around. So there's little competitive pressure to pay much for holding them. Savings-focused products, especially at online banks with lower overhead than a branch network, have far more incentive to compete on rate to attract deposits they can actually count on holding for a while. For context on where Drake's situation actually sits, the average American checking balance is around $16,900. But that number is pulled way up by a smaller group of people parking large amounts there. The median, the number that actually represents a typical household, is closer to $2,800. A lot of people are sitting on far more in checking than the typical American, without necessarily realizing it. There are two separate limits worth knowing, and they answer two different questions. The first is a hard, legal ceiling. How much of your money is actually protected if the bank itself fails? The second is a practical, everyday ceiling. How much should realistically sit in checking before it starts quietly losing value just by being there? Most people have never heard a clear answer to either one. So here's both, starting with the one that actually protects the money outright. Every dollar in a checking or savings account at an FDIC-insured bank is protected up to $250,000 per depositor, per bank, per ownership category. That number has been unchanged since October 2008, when it was permanently raised from $100,000 during the financial crisis. Here's what that actually means in practice. If a single account at a single bank holds more than $250,000, the amount above that line isn't automatically protected if the bank fails. Bank failures are rare, but they aren't theoretical. Depositors have lost uninsured funds in real failures within the last few years, which is exactly why this ceiling isn't just a technicality. The clearest recent example is Silicon Valley Bank's collapse in March of 2023, the largest U.S. bank failure since the 2008 financial crisis. A large share of its deposits belonged to businesses holding well over $250,000 in a single account. Regulators ultimately stepped in and guaranteed those uninsured deposits too, under a special systemic risk exception. But that was a discretionary emergency decision, not a guarantee that applies automatically to every bank failure going forward. The per-ownership category part matters more than most people realize. An individual account, a joint account, and a retirement account at the very same bank each get their own separate $250,000 coverage, which means a household can often protect well over $250,000. $0 at one single bank just by structuring accounts correctly, without moving a single dollar anywhere else. And for balances that genuinely exceed what ownership categories alone can cover, the simplest fix is the most obvious one: spreading deposits across more than one FDIC-insured bank, keeping each bank's balance comfortably under its own $250,000 line. One quick parody note for anyone banking at a credit union instead of a traditional bank: the same $250,000 coverage exists there too, just under a different name and a different agency. The NQA insures credit union deposits on essentially identical terms, per depositor, per credit union, per ownership category, so none of this changes depending on which type of institution the money sits in. The second ceiling is a lot smaller than most people assume, and it comes straight out of the same 50-30-20 framework this channel has covered before. 50% of after-tax income goes to needs, 30% to wants, and that combined 80% is exactly the kind of cash flow checking is built for, because nearly all of it is going to move within the month. On top of that, a small miscellaneous buffer, typically 5 to 10% of the monthly budget, helps absorb the expenses that are easy to forget: car registration, an annual subscription renewal, a birthday gift that wasn't on the calendar. That buffer belongs in checking too, since it exists specifically to prevent an overdraft on short notice. Put together, that's roughly 1 month of expenses, plus a small cushion. For a median U.S. household spending around $5,100 a month, that lands the practical checking ceiling somewhere close to $5,500 to $6,000, depending on how thick a buffer feels comfortable. Anything meaningfully beyond that is money that's no longer doing the job checking accounts are actually for. That's exactly the number Daniel was working from when he split his windfall. A comfortable 1 month buffer stayed in checking, and the rest moved somewhere built to actually hold value instead of just sitting there. So where does the rest go? For most people, the first stop is an emergency fund, 3 to 6 months of living expenses, held somewhere liquid enough to access quickly but not sitting in a zero-interest checking account the whole time. For that same median household, that's a target of roughly $15,300 to $30,600. The standard recommendation for holding that fund is a high-yield savings account. As of August 2026, top nationally available HYSAs were paying somewhere around 4 to 4.2% AP compared to that 0.07% national checking average. That's not a small gap. It's a completely different category of return for money that isn't going anywhere. Run the actual numbers on Drake's windfall. $32,000 sitting in checking at 0.07% earned him about $22 for the year. That same $32,000 in a 4%. Stretch that same comparison out 5 years instead of 1, with the HYSA balance compounding rather than sitting flat, and the gap widens well past $6,000, all from a single decision made once at the very start about where to physically hold the money. This is illustrative math based on current rates, not a guaranteed return. HYSA rates move with the broader interest rate environment and aren't fixed for 5 years the way this simplified comparison assumes. One priority order worth remembering here: build the emergency fund before general investing, with one exception. An employer 401k match should always come first. Since that's an immediate guaranteed return no savings account or investment can match on its own. Actually, opening one of these accounts is usually faster than people expect. Most online banks let a new HISA get opened and linked to an existing checking account in under 15 minutes, with no branch visit required. And the first transfer typically clears within 1 to 3 business days. The friction people imagine is almost always bigger than the friction that actually exists. It's worth naming honestly why so many people do what Drake did. A big number sitting in checking feels safe, visible, accessible, nothing to think about. But that feeling of safety and actual financial safety aren't the same thing, and this is exactly where they quietly split apart. Money sitting at 0.07% isn't just failing to grow, it's losing ground in real terms. Every year prices rise faster than that rate, which is effectively every year. It doesn't look like a loss on the account screen, because the number on the balance never goes down. But what that number can actually buy quietly shrinks the whole time it sits there. And there's a second quieter risk worth naming: A large checking balance is also often the easiest money to spend without noticing, since it's sitting right there next to a debit card with no extra step, no transfer, no friction at all between having it and spending it on something that wasn't actually planned. Money that isn't mentally separated by purpose tends to get treated as one undifferentiated pool, which makes it far easier to dip into for something that isn't actually an emergency. Physically moving the emergency fund into a separate account does more than earn a better rate. It also creates a small but real mental boundary that a single all-purpose checking balance never has. Put the whole structure together, and it looks like this. Checking holds roughly 1 month of expenses plus a small buffer. A high-yield savings account holds the 3 to 6 month emergency fund, plus any large windfall that isn't earmarked for something specific in the next few months. And only once both of those are in place does the conversation shift toward investing the rest for longer-term growth. The easiest way to actually maintain this, rather than just knowing it in theory, is a small recurring automatic transfer, moving anything above the checking buffer into the HISA on a set schedule, so the split happens without requiring a decision every single month. And for anyone whose total savings starts approaching that $250,000 FDIC line at a single bank, including the emergency fund and any other cash sitting in HSAs, that's the moment to start splitting deposits across a second bank, well before the balance actually crosses it. A quick way to check where things actually stand right now: pull up the checking balance. Subtract 1 month of typical expenses plus a small buffer, and whatever's left over is the amount that's currently sitting idle at close to 0% instead of earning something. For most people looking at that number for the first time, it's larger than expected, which is exactly the gap this whole video has been pointing at. Mistake 1. Treating a windfall as temporary. Drake told himself he'd move the money once things settled down, and 8 months later, it was still sitting in the same checking account, earning the same $22 a year. Temporary cash has a way of quietly becoming permanent cash the moment there's no specific deadline attached to moving it. Mistake 2. Chasing a checking account's promotional interest rate without reading how long it lasts. Some checking accounts do advertise a higher introductory AP to attract new customers, but those rates are typically temporary, often reverting to the near-zero national average after 3 to 6 months, while the account still gets marketed on the headline number. Mistake 3. Assuming a big balance is automatically covered without ever checking the ownership category it's actually registered under. FDIC and CUA coverage isn't automatic beyond the base $250,000. It depends on how the account is titled, and a mistitled account can leave far more exposed than anyone realizes. A quick check through each institution's own online coverage calculator or a direct question to the bank is the only way to know for certain rather than assume. 2 ceilings, 2 different jobs. The FDIC line, $250,000 per depositor, per bank, per ownership category, protects the money outright. Go past it at a single bank without planning around it. And the excess isn't automatically covered. Credit unions included under NQA on the same terms. The practical ceiling, roughly 1 month of expenses plus a small buffer, protects the money's value. Anything held well beyond that in a near-zero interest checking account is quietly losing ground every year it sits there, instead of earning something in an HISA that takes about 15 minutes to open. Same windfall, same week, over $1,000 apart a year later. And widening further every year after that, not from a better investment, not from a lucky pick, just from knowing where the money actually belonged the whole time. This video is for educational purposes only and is not personalized financial advice. If breaking down real numbers like this is useful, subscribe, new video every week. Next time, we get into exactly how much you should actually have saved at every age and how that number compares to what most Americans really have at each stage of their working life.